So Melanie, can you tell us what your book is about?
Well, my book, called Georgian Beginnings, is about the building of 14 Henrietta Street from the mid-18th century, from 1750, and its first residents. So the Molesworths, Lord Chancellor John Bowes, and then Sir Lucius and Anne O'Brien. And it really charts the lives that were lived within this house in the second half of the 18th century.
And as a historian, what draws you to the 18th century?
Well, I'm an architectural historian, so I'm really interested in the buildings, particularly to the Georgian terraced townhouses like Henrietta Street. But I'm also interested in the people behind the buildings, the architects, the building developers, the craftsmen who built them, and then the people who lived in them. My aim with the book was to repopulate 14 Henrietta Street with its first residents and breathe life back into the 18th century building.
In your book, you describe Henrietta Street as Dublin's first great Georgian street. Can you tell us a bit about what made it so great?
Well, Henrietta Street was really pioneering. It was first laid out or developed from the mid-1720s by a man called Luke Gardner. He was a banker, a politician and a property speculator, and he bought the land here on the north side of Dublin city, and he laid it out for building in these two opposing rows of 15 houses, and they were really pioneering for their time, cutting edge in their design, really beautiful, elegant, well-proportioned red brick houses, parapet roofs above, carved stone door cases below, and then these exquisite, really richly decorated interiors within. But it was really their scale that was so remarkable in Dublin at that time. Huge houses, 4 stories high, some of them as wide as 82 feet wide. So they were palatial. And this was really quite remarkable for its time. The street itself was also really quite sophisticated, 50 feet wide between the railings set before the houses, with 22 feet wide stable lanes behind. So it established new levels of sophistication and elegance in Dublin city.
In your book, you say that during the first 30 years of Henrietta Street's existence, it was home to 6 titled residents, 2 army generals, 3 archbishops, 2 speakers of the House of Commons, and the Lord Chancellor of Ireland. For a very small street, this was quite remarkable.
Yeah, it was really remarkable. But what we really have to remember is Luke Gardner, the man who developed this street, was also one of its first residents. Now, Gardner was a self-made man, and at the time that he was building and developing Henrietta Street, he was also working his way up the ladder of success within Ireland's government. So by investing in this really quite high-class street, in this high-class development, and attracting quality buyers, Gardner was not just creating a really elite residential enclave, but he was surrounding himself by really influential neighbours. The first and foremost of these was Archbishop Hugh Boulter, the primate of all Ireland, and where he went, the great and good of Irish high society followed. And Henrietta Street was a real hub of political power during the 18th century.
Can you tell me what Dublin was like during the 18th century for the wealthy and people of high status?
Sure, well, Dublin in the 18th century was the second city of the British Empire, if we can call it that at that point. And it was really quite a cosmopolitan city. The 18th century was a time of relative peace and prosperity, and with that came a real building boom within the city. Medieval lanes and alleyways became these wide and convenient streets. Really imposing cut stone buildings were erected. There were monuments of the real power and wealth of the governing elite. And then, of course, row after row of these red brick houses built as residences for parliamentary politicians during the parliamentary season, which took place every 2 years. And so they really lived very luxurious lives. But this is just one side of the story. Georgian Dublin was really a city of 2 faces. So while the minority of wealthy Protestants lived lives of great luxury, poverty was rife among the majority of the citizens.
Your book goes into great detail about the people who lived in 14 Henrietta Street in the 18th century. Was there any one person that you most connected to or that you were most interested in?
Well, I was really interested in the women. And that doesn't mean that the book is largely concentrates on the women, unfortunately. And this is not because of a lack of interest. It's more about a lack of evidence that we have this male-dominated affair. Women in the 18th century, certainly married women, rarely appear in the history books, rarely appear in documents. A married woman wouldn't have her name on the lease of a building. Her name wouldn't appear on a tradesman's bill, even if she commissioned the item. Respectable women's names never would have appeared in the public press, unless, of course, it was an announcement of a birth or death or marriage. So the evidence for the lives lived by the women here is really quite thin on the ground. There are letters and diaries, and there is one particular journal by Nancy O'Brien, who lived here in the 1770s. But one of the characters that I'm really fascinated with was Lady Mary Molesworth. Now, you would think that a lady who married a viscount when she was a teenager herself would seem quite remote. But actually, when you start to think about her life, the same events were important to her as they are for me. Again, births, marriages, deaths, the safe arrival of her children, their health, preoccupations with infectious disease, even her husband's health, his wealth, his job prospects. So there are these universal themes about the women that really strike a chord for me today, and I'd love to know more about her.
So you mentioned Lady Molesworth there, and we know that the Molesworth family were the first family that lived here in 14 Henrietta Street. Can you tell us a little bit more about that family?
Well, the Molesworths were a really high-ranking, prestigious Anglo-Irish family. They had large estates, country estates in England and Yorkshire, and also North County Dublin, just outside Swords. They also owned land in Dublin City, and actually in the 1730s, they laid it out into a handsome building, as the quote goes. Lord Molesworth was a really highly decorated soldier, and he was also quite old when they got married, and when they moved here he was in his 70s. Mary Molesworth was 45 years his junior, but they seem to have had a happy relationship. They had 7 children, so she was certainly kept busy, and she really fulfilled a remarkable array of roles within the marital home. She was a household manager, a high society hostess, a mother, and a wife. So she had to negotiate these blurred boundaries between the private world of her family and the public life of her husband. And I think she did that with great agility.
This townhouse has many rooms. Can you tell us how one family lived in a space like this?
Sure, these houses were really seasonal residences. They were city bases for politicians who came to Dublin from their country estates when Parliament was sitting. And that was only every 2 years in the winter months. During the winter months, or the social season as it was known, these houses would have been really quite intensely used. They would have served as settings for high society parties, for hospitable display, and they would have hosted really large-scale entertainments, probably on a nightly basis. They would also have been used for daytime events. Women would have taken tea in the parlour, they would have dined in the dining room that we're sitting in now, and they would have taken tea or played card games in the drawing room next door. So there was an array of social occasions or social functions fulfilled by these houses. But to say they were seasonally used, So the residents would have come up from their country estates, but they would have sent their servants ahead to prepare the house, to take the covers off the furnishings, to wash down the walls, which I find quite strange, but they washed all the walls and all the floors, and then aired the buildings. And the families would have come and stayed here for the Dublin season from Michaelmas, which is early November, to St. Patrick's Day.
This townhouse has many rooms. Can you tell us how one family lived in a space like this, between the private and public spaces, were there rooms for hosting? Can you tell us about how that was and how it was laid out?
Well, from what we can gather, and the evidence is a little thin on the ground, but the houses themselves were divided between sort of public and private spaces. So the entrance hall, as it is today, would be quite a public space. You can see how large it is, how wide the door is. It had to be wide enough for the ladies' skirts to fit in. And you would first enter into the entrance hall, and this is where visitors would arrive, and they would be brought up the stairs, up the grand staircase, to the first floor rooms of the piano nobile. And these were the public spaces. These were the party rooms, almost the entertainment spaces. We would have had the drawing room to the front of the house, and this would have hosted a variety of entertainments, playing cards, music recitals of chamber music, but also dances and balls. And then the room that we're in now, the rear room, would have been used as a dining room in the middle of the 18th century. But the family wouldn't necessarily have used these rooms on a daily basis. The ground floor rooms would have been slightly smaller in scale. That was the parlour story. And these would have fulfilled a more private function or informal function. So ladies would take tea there, the family might have their breakfast in the rear parlour. So there was quite a divide in terms of the physical space and the functions it served. But actually, this first floor, the piano nobile that we're in here, the boundaries blurred slightly. We have the grand parade up the main staircase. We have the drawing room, we have the dining room, but we also have the smaller antechamber where the bed is today. And that is a room that, say, blurred boundaries, where private and public worlds met. So it could be a closet for the man of the house or the lord of the house to meet his closest acquaintance, a study, a room of contemplation, or a bedroom as it is now.
And yes, people on the tour actually ask us a lot about the size of the bed that we have here on display. It's a little bit smaller than beds that we're used to. Can you tell us why that is?
Well, again, from what we can gather from inventories, we think that people slept sitting up or propped up. Inventories show really large amounts of bolsters, of pillows, of cushions, and layers of mattresses. So it seems like it wasn't that people were shorter, and that's sometimes what's imagined, but rather the way that they slept. I think they thought it was dangerous to lie fully on your back when sleeping.
The last family that lived here in 14 Henrietta Street in the 18th century were the O'Brien family. And you talk about Lucius and his wife Nancy being very much in love and a great match. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how maybe that might have been unusual for the time?
That's right. They seem really devoted to each other, which really wasn't the norm during the 18th century, or at least with elite couples. It seemed to be a love match. And as I say, they were really devoted to each other, and we get real insights into that in Nancy's journal, or her memorandum of married life, and also in letters from Sir Lucius writing to his wife Nancy. She describes her husband in her journal as a pious man, I'm quoting, free from passion, sullenness, ill nature or resentment. She says, none can know his heart as I do, who has the happiness of being his wife. These are really strong declarations of love. And we know that she really didn't want to be parted from her husband. Their country estate was Dromoland in County Clare. But when Sir Lucius had to be in Dublin, when Parliament was sitting, Nancy always came with him. She accompanied him to Bath, to London. She just did not want to be away from him, and he was the same. When he was separated from her for one lengthy period, he wrote, he said, "The truth is, my own Nancy has made home so dear to me that I do not find relish for places from which she is absent." So really quite a loving relationship, but something that actually makes me very sad. Sir Lucius, as much as he was devoted to his Nancy, had a natural son who lived in Balbriggan, and his father gave him £10 as an annuity every year for his upkeep. So a little bit sad, a bit of a downside, but still a devoted husband.
There are things we'll never know about the past. What things do you wish that you could have found out about 14 Henrietta Street that you couldn't?
Well, firstly, an awful lot is missing from the records. I'd love to know more about the women. I'd love to know more about the servants. But something that's particularly important to me are the people who built the house. As an architectural historian, and because of a project I'm working on, which is called Craft Value at Trinity College in Dublin, and it's about valorising the skill of the people who made the houses such as 14 Henrietta Street. So we'd like to know who they were. We have no idea of the name of an architect behind the design of this house, or any of the building craftsmen who built the walls, who decorated the rich interiors and furnished the houses. So that would be really important for me.
If you were able to time travel back in time to the 18th century, what would you be most interested in finding out or discovering or seeing?
Maybe 3 things. I would love to be invited to one of the parties, just to experience the glamour, the show and the parade of the social occasions during that time. I'd love to go to one of the dinners and have fricassee of frogs and badger flambé, which I have on good authority were served during the period. I'd love to be a fly on the wall in one of the private moments in these houses and really know about the lives lived within the walls. And then the last thing was, I'd love to be on the muddy building site before they were built. I'd love to see actually how this house came into being.
Going back to the museum experience itself, can you tell us from your own memories of being on the tour? You've been on the tour many times. Is there anything that stands out for you, or any favourite moment?
I think it has to be in the antechamber, this bed, Paula Meehan's beautiful poem, and then of course Dr. Moss's bed itself. I think it's a really pivotal moment in the tour, the transition, I suppose, from the Georgian period into the next stage. And it's a real bridging point for people when they start to hear about the lives, particularly of the women and the difficulties of childbirth experienced within this house. I've had students break down in tears listening to that poem. It's really, really emotive and evocative, and it's bound up in the physical fabric of the house, of the museum itself. So yeah, really beautiful moment.